Wahi noam Adonai Eloheinu alenu ma'asedenu kunana alenu ma'asedenu kunanehu. Shalom Aleichem. Welcome all. Tonight we have a topic which is going to take us on a very interesting journey. A journey through history. A journey through psychology. A journey through the mind of man. We're going to learn about the very important Christian holiday of Christmas. And you might think that's a funny topic for a rabbi to be discussing. But we must understand that this holiday of Christmas and the psychology underlying it, all the more so the history underlying it, plays a very important role in the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, specifically Christians and Jews. And while understanding Christmas, we are also, of course, going to discuss Hanukkah, because Hanukkah, as we know, falls on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, and the Christian holiday falls on the 25th day of the month of December, 25 and 25. No, this is not a coincidence. As we're going to read, as we proceed in the book of Maccabees, that documents the history of the story of Hanukkah, we're going to realize that the relationship between the two holidays is very ancient. That indeed, the precursor of the Christian Christmas was very much in relationship to the establishment of Hanukkah. And the two holidays have very profound spiritual and psychological meanings which truly explain to us the difference between Judaism and Christianity, the psyche of the Jew and the psyche of the Christian, and even, if you will, the future relationships between our two peoples. Now, it's important to understand something. Christianity as a religion, as we're going to see, is built upon premises, traditions, and teachings which have a very spurious historical origin. Judaism, in that respect, is very different. But in order to understand a thing, we must understand the beginnings of that thing. And therefore, being that Christmas is allegedly the celebration of the birth of Christ, let's understand what this is, because it's the alleged origins of the entire Christian faith. Let's understand that, historically speaking, what is Christmas? Where did it come from? What does it really mean? Today, the Christmas holiday in the Western world is more a holiday of of merchandise than it is a holiday of religion. It is a holiday of commercialism more than anything else, and there's actually a reason for that. We'll get to that as we continue as well. Now, according to some, the Christian message is peace on earth and goodwill towards man. Now, that's a concept that I would pray everybody would agree with. The question is, does it really fit in here? Let's learn the history now. And I must add, when we come to discuss the history of Christmas, I was very surprised to recognize that many of the sources that I'm going to be quoting to you from tonight are actually from Christian sources themselves. I have long known, as a student of history, that many of the Christian traditions, as we will discuss, the date itself, Christmas trees, etc., and so on, all had their origins in paganism. I thought that that was something that only Jewish people knew, scholars knew. I was very surprised to find how widespread this knowledge was in Christian circles themselves. And so therefore, I am not here as a critic or one to attack the faith of another. All right? We are not here to discuss tonight faith. We are here to discuss psychology, history, spirituality. I'm here to speak to your minds. The faith which is in your heart, if you're a Christian listening to this message, it's between you and God. My job here is to educate with regards to truth, and allow me to use a Christian statement. Let the truth set you free. The history of Christmas. The exact dating of Christmas, I'm actually reading here from a number of sources that I've taken from web searches and such. So you'll just allow me to read. Most of these come from, I got something here from ChristianityToday.com and some other sources. I'm just going to read to you from a number of the materials, and you'll sit and listen. And I'm sure if you do your own research, your web searches online, you will find all the same material that I have here. The exact dating of Christmas has been a subject of great debate and disagreement, although tradition and custom has affixed it now to December 25th. This date has little to do with actual Christian history, and much to do with attempts by Christians to appeal to potential pagan converts by appropriating their own festivals of Saturnalia and Brumalia. We'll discuss those as we proceed. But in the earliest calendars to even list December 25th as Christmas, the earliest, was in the year 336. There is no hint in the Gospels about the time of the year that Yeshu was supposedly to have been born. However, it could not have been in winter, because in that part of the world, meaning Bethlehem as we know, it's the rainy season, it's the cold season, shepherds would not be out at night. This means that early Christianity found itself in the odd position of trying to tell everybody about what they claimed is the most tremendous birth ever, without being able to say when it really happened. Now, this is a very important point. Any of you can go now to www.weather.com and type in for Bethlehem, Israel, I emphasize, and see what the weather is like at night. It's too cold for shepherds to be staying out night with their flock. And therefore, the story as it's portrayed in the Christian Bible, I believe in the Gospel of Luke, could not possibly have happened in the month of December. I thought this was a great revelation, only to find out Christians have known this all along. Interestingly, the concept of celebrating the birth of Christ was not even accepted by many of the original church fathers themselves. The church father Origen even argued that Christians should refrain from celebrating birthdays at all, because, he says here, Scripture portrays evil people like Herod and the Pharaohs as doing the same. It is entirely coincidental, according to what I'm reading here, that in the year 274, the Common Era, when the winter solstice, which is the Saturnalia holiday, which we'll get into in a moment, when it fell on December 25th, the pagan emperor Aurelian proclaimed that day to be what he called here the Natalis Solis Invicti, the festival of the birth of the invincible sun. And where he got that from, we'll proceed to understand. Throughout pagan Europe, Christianity was known for supplanting pagan celebrations in holy places in an effort to speed conversion, and it is easy to see this as another example of the same. But there was more involved than just the date. Pagan Rome at this time of year was deeply involved with celebrations. It was the important festival of the old vegetation god of Saturn, who as a god was supposedly died and displaced by Jupiter, the sky god. And the entire week then, from December 17th through the 24th, they had a special holiday period where no work was done, and the only law was for everyone to be of good cheer and exchanging of gifts, things that sound very similar to modern-day Christmas observance. Origen, he lived about the year 185 through 254. And again, he preached that it was wrong to it. He says, honor Christ is the same way Pharaoh and Herod. So he was totally opposed to the concept of the innovation of a celebration of Christ's alleged birthday. In Christian record, the date actually was argued. Clement of Alexandria was a contemporary, I believe, here of Origen. He believed that the date of Yeshki's birth was May the 20th, Some said it was April the 18th. Hippolodius said it could have been January 2nd, November 17th, November 20th, or March 25th. There is a Latin treatise that was written in the year 243, which said March 21st. Polycarp also concluded that it could have been on a Wednesday because that was the day that the sun was created, etc. So again, the origins of the day, December 25th, had that origins in that time. What we discussed was in the year, I believe, 274, was it? 274, according to this other edition I have here, was 273, where in which we have this Natalis Solis Invicti, the Roman birth of the unconquered sun. Now this is also the birthday of a Persian myth god called Mithra, who is called the son of righteousness. And this was a god or a religion which was very popular amongst Roman soldiers. The Romans, of course, learned and received this from the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, received this when they conquered, under Alexander the Great, the Persian Empire. So the winter solstice, which is the Saturnalia holiday, was another celebration of the sun just a few days earlier. And again, according to ChristianityToday.com, seeing that pagans are already exalting deities with some parallels to the true deity, what they called the true deity, church leaders decided to commandeer the date and introduce a new festival. Listen to this. This is from, again, ChristianityToday.com. The pagan origins of the Christmas date, as well as pagan origins for many Christmas customs, gift-giving, merrymaking from the Roman Saturnalia, greenery, lights, and charity from the Roman New Year, Yule logs, and various foods from Teutonic feasts, have always fueled arguments against the holiday, saying it's just paganism wrapped in a Christian bow. Wow, I was very, very surprised that Christians would be so forthcoming in the acknowledgement of the origins of something which they consider to be so sacred and dear to them. But let's understand now the history. Part of this history you can actually find in the Tanakh, but it's a known historical fact that the Greek armies of Alexander the Great conquered Persia, and while conquering Persia, of course, absorbed much of its holidays, of its culture. It's very similar to when the British had the empire around the world, and how much of those conquered nations, be they from the Middle East, India, had influenced and become integral parts of the British and thus the later American cultures. So we recognize a standard fact. While a nation can conquer one militarily, the conquered nation can in essence fight back culturally by the integration and absorption into the greater culture of certain philosophies, archetypal imageries, concepts, feelings, beliefs. Now, just as a matter to document here, the Roman festival, which was called the Saturnalia, was a celebration of what was called the rebirth of the sun. At the winter solstice, which is about December 20th, December 21st, is the time when the days begin to grow longer. So instead of sunset being at 4:20, it's at 4:21, then 4:22, and therefore this was considered the victory of the sun, or if you will, the rebirth of the sun. And there is also correlated to this a relationship with the planet Saturn. We'll discuss Saturn and its relationship here as we move along, because it plays a very essential role in understanding the difference of the relationship between Jewish and Christian concepts, which are based upon an understanding of the planet Saturn. Interesting that the Roman philosopher Seneca once observed that all of Rome, in quotes, went mad during this festival of Saturnalia. And Saturnalia, as we see, eventually became Christmas. There was another holiday related to the Saturnalia called Brumalia. This was a pagan festival held at the winter solstice. And again, it was considered to be a time of the giving of presents and celebration, etc. But now, getting back to the relationship of this rebirth of the sun and understanding, if you will, sun worship. And yeah, the pun is meant S-U-N sun and S-O-N sun. The two merged together in the minds of the pagan Romans at the time. The first day in ancient Roman calendars, we know, was Sunday. As we know, the seventh day of the week, of course, is Shabbat. Sunday, corresponding to the word sun, again was called the day of Sol Invictus, the day of the invincible God of the sun. We Jews, as we know, we celebrated the Shabbat. And the Shabbat, the planet that ruled there, was Saturn. And the relationship, again, of Saturn to the Jew we'll discuss as we move along. But Sunday was Sol Invictus Day. And the 25th of December, the ancient Romans made this to be Sol Invictus Day of the calendar, which had its Mithraic origins. Now let's understand the Mithraic origins. Going back into old Persian tradition. In Persia, there existed a religion called Zoroastrianism. It was allegedly founded by a person named Zarathustra. The Zarathustra. He lived in Persia about the time when Bnei Israel were there. Now, Zarathustra actually did not innovate the cult of Mithra. Mithra and who he was and what he was we'll discuss in a minute. But Zarathustra actually played a very pivotal role in concepts which have become the foundation of Christianity and in some respects even Islam, and to those uneducated even in Judaism. Zarathustra was the one who innovated the concept of duality in the world, that there is a God and a devil, and that they're duking it out, fighting it out for ultimate control of the universe, and that ultimately the world is going to end in an apocalypse and everything's going to blow up. Now, with as much as we discuss about the apocalypse, the Ketzayamim, nowhere does it ever say the world's going to blow up. There is never such a harshness to it in the Jewish circles as we read about it in non-Jewish circles. And this concept of the Satan being almost an equal to God, the dark equal or twin, and the two of them duking it out, is a foreign concept to Judaism. We recognize things as being so farly different from that. However, even as that existed, prior to this, there existed the concept and the worship of the Persian sun god, who was, again, we said, was Mithra. Now, the history of Mithra and its relationship to Christianity is profound, because Mithra was said to have been born in a cave where shepherds came to worship him, believing him to be the Son of God. His birthday, interestingly, was said to have been the 25th day of December. Why? Again, Saturnalia had its origins here, the rebirth of the sun, and the pun on the word sun. He was believed to have been killed by the god of darkness, but have been risen from the dead. Again, you have a Zarathustrian influence here. His resurrection was celebrated each year in the early spring. Sound interesting? In observance of this, a white bull or lamb was slain over a metal grating. Underneath the grating, blood from the land dripped down and baptized, in quotes, new converts who would join Mithra in the eternal war against evil. His followers then ate bread and wine in mass communion meal. And almost 500 years later, before the birth of Yashki, all this happened. Now, I'm quoting this from a Christian website. The author comments on this and says that Satan was preparing a counterfeit and illusion to deceive and confuse would-be followers of the true Lamb. He continues and states this satanic cult became a major competitor of Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Romans were eager participants in this cult, and he says here that the cult had one day in the week which was sacred, the day of the sun, Sunday. Now, this has always been a fundamentalist Christian response to the pagan origins, which apparently they seem to know all too well. And that is, the response is, the devil did it. All right? He did it to confuse us. He did it to deceive us. That all things in the world which don't apparently align with Scripture, the devil did it. I have actually heard people say that dinosaur bones, were placed deep into the earth by the devil to make us believe in the deception of evolution and to confuse us in the ways of God. Well, let's not go there. Let's not open ourselves up to silliness. The reason why such things are silly, the prejudice that is based upon, has no foundation with people of open heart and open mind. The history of the observance of the Christian holiday of Christmas was not controversial only in ancient days. Believe it or not, this is what I learned recently and surprised me. It was controversial even up until recent times. A little history. The celebration of Christmas is so ubiquitous that people have trouble imagining large segments of Christian society not celebrating Christmas or even objecting to its celebration. But that was the situation not too long ago. Many people are unaware that many Protestant fundamentalists, like Puritans, objected to Christmas so much that wherever they held power, they passed laws banning its observance. The Scottish Presbyterian Church banned the observance of Christmas, believe it or not, in 1583. And James I had to reinstitute it by force of arms. Puritans in early American colonies banned the celebration of Christmas, not simply because of the lack of scriptural support for such a festival, but because it tended to be associated with drunkenness and rowdy behavior. In 1659, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a strict law against the observance of Christmas as a holiday. Quote, "Whoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas as the like, either in forbearing labor, feasting, or other way, upon such account as aforesaid, every such person so offending shall pay for each offense 5 shillings as a fine to the county." Even as late as 1706, a Puritan mob surrounded an Anglican church where Christmas services were being held. And again, I'm quoting to you here from a Christian source on the history of things. I was shocked and amazed that such objections actually existed. But these objections still exist, surprisingly, to this day. Online, I found an interesting document called Santa Claus and the History and Customs of Christmas. Now, Santa Claus, we know, was a mythical character based upon a 4th century, what would have been Turkish individual who was known to be wealthy and giving presents to children. He was elevated and brought to a position of speciality, and to this day, he's become, Santa Claus. But through the years, he has held a much, much less commercial position. Without getting too much into the details of Santa Claus, we don't have to really go there, I found this very interesting attack upon the concept of Santa Claus coming from a Baptist minister out of Ohio, in which he has a 10-page document here, in which he condemns the presentation of Santa as being an imitation of God. For him, God, of course, is Yashki. He says that they're trying to say that Santa Claus is eternal, just like Yashki is or God is. In their opinion, God forbid that we should ever misinterpret, that any of us would ever believe that Yashki is God. God forbid, terrible, terrible thing, but from their point of view. And he goes on and attacks Santa and all these different things, as saying that the image is attempted to be a recreation of Yashki. And then he goes into the great details to describe the history of the idolatry of the entire Christian holiday. The Yule log, which is that log that they burn, he said, was adapted from the English custom, from ancient Scandinavian practice of kindling bonfires in honor of the winter solstice, which supposedly helped the dying earth to regain its strength and allow the rebirth of the sun. So that concept is pagan in origin, idolatrous. And the mistletoe, I believe that they say you're supposed to kiss under the mistletoe. In ancient Britain, it had the origin with this pagan custom. The sacred plant of the Druid was mistletoe. The archdruid and his priests performing elaborate ceremonies around it at the winter solstice. Because of the pagan associations, the mistletoe is seldom used in the church, the guy says here. But we don't have to get into all the details here. The Christmas tree, decorated with lights to celebrate supposedly the birth of Christ. This had its origins, again, in ancient Baal worship. He quotes here from Jeremiah, chapter 10. It says, "Hear the word of the Lord, Hashem, not to bring trees," and he's relating it to the Asherah tree, which was actually forbidden by God in the Torah. And he brings down the relationship here of the concept of Mithra, how that he was supposedly executed and buried in a tree, and that the whole concept of the tree, of course, has its biblical origins in idolatry. So we have this vast compilation of numerous pagan idolatrous origins of things now that have come together under one name, Christmas. And this goes back to the interesting statement. If you remember, the Christian concept about Christmas is, they say, keep Christ in Christmas. But you must now be led to ask the question, what exactly is Christian about Christmas? It has nothing to do with Yashki, nothing to do with the time of his birth. There is no relationship to presents, to a Yule log, to Christmas trees, or anything of the kind. Even the date, the time, the concepts. All of these things have their source in paganism, which have absolutely no source whatsoever in the Christian message. Before I move along now to explain why these things are important for us to understand, just an interesting little tidbit here. I was speaking to a friend of mine, a student in New York the other day, and I was sharing with him some of this material. And he laughs and he says, "But Rabbi, Christmas is good for business." And I laughed and I said, I guess it is. In all due respect, a lot of merchants, they make a good proportion of their year's business during what's called the Christmas holiday season. And I read something very interesting about the Christmas holiday season. It began after World War II, or I should say during World War II. People began to complain about the over-commercialization and started again to put the Christ back into Christmas. But why at that point in history? They said blame it on the war. During World War II, people had to shop early in order to get their Christmas gifts to the troops overseas in time. Merchants, of course, benefited from the early shopping and made a point of reminding people to shop early. But they never stopped. And so the lengthy holiday shopping season was born, and it gets longer and longer ever since. So, we find here that the entire Christian concept, everything that revolves around this concept of Christmas, is based upon pagan symbols, which in psychology we call archetypes. Now, we must understand the psychological value of image, archetypes, symbols, and how crucial they are as an expression of the psyche of the human being. And this will help us understand the difference in the psyche of the Jew and the Christian. Let me quote to you here from a very famous psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm, in his book Psychology and Religion, page 110. With regards to ritual, he states, the need for common ritual is thoroughly appreciated by the leaders of political systems. They offer new forms of politically colored ceremonies which satisfy this need and bind the average citizen to political creed by means of it. Modern man in democratic cultures does not have many meaning rituals. It's not surprising then that the need for ritualistic practices have taken all sorts of diversified forms. Now remember, Dr. Fromm is speaking modern applications of ritual, but the concept of the need for ritual has always been the case. So listen. Continuing, he says, elaborate rituals in lodges, rituals in connection with patriotic reverence for the state, rituals concerning with polite behavior, and many other expressions of this need for shared action. Yet they exhibit only the impoverishment of devotional aim and separation from those ideals officially recognized. They appeal to organizations like the preoccupation with behavior expressed in etiquette books, gives convincing proof of modern man's need for ritual and the emptiness of those he performs. The need for ritual is undeniable and vastly underestimated. Now, indeed, Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, he is the one who coined the term archetype and expressed that it's an actual necessity for the mind to express itself through image and picture. Well, as we see the development of Christmas, the picture or image that the Christian has embraced as an expression of what goes on inside them. As we will proceed, we will understand Hanukkah as the source and how it is the image that we Jews have embraced to express our inner identity. Understand now, when we discuss these pagan origins, we condemn them as idolatry. Hear now the words of Dr. Fromm with regards to a psychological understanding of idolatry. It's nice and easy to be fundamentalist and say idolatry, bad, God says so. But we never really understand it as how it infects the human mind and contaminates the way that we think and feel, to the harm of ourselves as individuals and to the harm of us collectively in a society. Dr. Fromm writes, we forget that the essence of idolatry is not the worship of this or that particular idol, but it's a specific human attitude. This attitude may be described as the deification of things, of partial aspects of the world, and man's submission to these things, in contrast to an attitude in which life is devoted to the realization of the highest principles of life, those of love and reason, to the aim of becoming what man potentially is, a being made in the likeness of God. This then outlines the foundation here. Because when we come to understand the nature of Judaism as opposed to Christianity, we are looking at the difference between truth and falsehood. And let me give you an example. I'm going to read to you a section from a book called Gospel Fictions, written by Randall Helms. On page 9, he writes like this. In the 1st century of the Common Era, there appeared at the eastern end of the Mediterranean a remarkable religious leader who taught the worship of one God and declared that religion meant not the sacrifice of beasts, but the practice of charity and piety and the shunning of hatred and enmity. He was said to have worked miracles of goodness, casting out demons, healing the sick, and raising the dead. His exemplary life led some of his followers to claim he was a son of God, though he called himself the Son of Man. Accused of sedition against Rome, he was arrested. After his death, his disciples claimed he had risen from the dead, appeared to them alive, then ascended into heaven. So, who is this teacher and wonder worker? His name was Apollonius of Tyana, and he died in 98 of the year Common Era. And his story may be read in the book written by Flavius Philostratus's Life of Apollonius. Readers too hastily assume that the proceeding describing Apollonius was really discussing Yeshu. He can be forgiven this error because it reflects how readily the human imagination embroiders the career of notable figures of the past with common mythical and fictional embellishments. Here, then, is the truth. Understand now that in the days of old, when the Greeks came into the land of Israel, the Greeks were an international power. They had absorbed Persian culture. They had absorbed the culture of all the different races and religions around them. And everyone was coming into this melting pot concept, with one exception. There was this group of stubborn Jews living in the land of Israel. The king, or the Persian king, the Greek king at that time, wanted to create one people. Quoting to you from the book of Maccabees, in the first chapter from the 41st verse, it says that the king wrote to his whole kingdom that they should become all one people, and everyone should give up his particular practices and, of course, join with him. Now, the concept of unity, peace on earth, goodwill towards men, we've heard this before, have we not? That's a great concept. But look at what its price tag is. The acceptance of a lie at the price of truth. That is too high a price to pay. In order to accomplish his task, on the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, in the 145th year, the king erected a dreadful desecration upon the altar in the towns of Judah. Again, I'm quoting to you from the book of Maccabees, from the 54th verse of the first chapter. And they went to suppress Judaism because of its separatist ways. It says here then, on the 25th of the month, they offered sacrifice upon the altar, which was set up on the altar of burnt offerings. Specifically on that day of the 25th day of December, or Kislev, was the day chosen by the Greek authorities to desecrate the altar in Jerusalem. This, of course, began the process which led to the Hanukkah Wars. As we know, the Hanukkah Wars were fought for 3 years. The Maccabees, through great sacrifice, through military prowess, the small were able to defeat the large, the weak were able to defeat the mighty, and the war of emancipation, fought to the point of self-sacrifice, was successful. The Maccabees came back to Jerusalem. Quoting here from the 4th chapter, it says that the whole army gathered together and they went up to Mount Zion. They found the sanctuary desolated and the altar polluted and the doors burned up, weeds growing in the courtyard, etc., and so on. Apparently the unity concept of the Greeks was not followed through. They tore down the old altar and put it away because they didn't want to say anybody, God forbid, that Jews offered on an altar that was also by non-Jews. And this process of building continued. And then it says here in the 52nd verse of the 4th chapter, and they arose early on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, and offered sacrifice according to the Torah upon the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made. At the time and on the day that the heathens polluted it, it was rededicated with songs and harps and lutes. And of course the rededication feast lasted for 8 days, and there we have Hanukkah. So understand that the Saturnalia holiday of the winter solstice, this celebration of the sun god Mithra, which was observed in Greek times and adopted later by the Romans, was the holiday that the Greeks chose as the day to dominate the altar of Hashem in Jerusalem. And that is why it was so important that when victory was achieved, it was specifically on that day that the altar had to be rededicated as a statement, as an archetype, as a symbol of the victory, not only of the God of Israel over the God of the nations, but of the concept of truth over the concept of a lie. That was the message of Hanukkah. And it shines to this day when we call it a festival of lights. Has nothing to do with candles. Has nothing to do with how long the oil stood lit in the temple. The light we're speaking about is the light of truth, the light of self-sacrifice, the light of enlightenment, the light which opens the eyes and lets the lies be exposed and destroyed. This is the history of Hanukkah. This is what Hanukkah is meant to be. A time of emancipation. And emancipation is an essential concept to what we need as peoples to learn today. I spent a good amount of time to explain to you the history of Christianity, the history of Christmas, and we can go on in other times, but we'll stay focused on our topic. And the reason is, why we went into so much detail, is to help us understand the truth of how things that were one thing have become something else, and that people are deluded into believing a myth that has no foundation in truth whatsoever. Now, we might ask a question. Great question. Why did God allow a religion like Christianity, based upon its falsehoods, to rise up and to pretty much conquer the world, and to be such a scourge to the Jewish people? This question is actually answered by none other than Rambam himself. In his Hilchot Melachim, the Laws of Kings, in the 11th parak, the 11th chapter, in the 4th halacha, towards the end, he writes like this. With relationship to Christianity, he calls it a great stumbling block. And he says, can there be a greater stumbling block? All the prophets spoke of the Messiah as the Redeemer of Israel and Israel's Savior, who would gather in the dispersed Jews and strengthen the observance of the Torah. But by contrast, Christianity causes the Jews to be slain by the sword, their remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve a God other than Hashem. Despite the fact they call it that, the concept of Yashki and how he is presented today has its foundations in ancient Mithraism, the Persian religion adopted by the Greco-Romans, which became the foundation of Christianity, Christmas, and even sources within Easter. I challenge any of you to find an Easter bunny in the Christian Bible, an Easter egg hunts. Rambam continues and he states, nevertheless, the intent of the Creator of the world is not within the power of man to comprehend. For his ways are not our ways, nor his thoughts our thoughts. Listen to how he says, ultimately all the deeds of Yashki, who will only serve to prepare the way for Messiah's coming and the improvement of the entire world, motivating the nations to serve God together, as Tzefaniah in the 3rd chapter and 9th pasuk states, I will make the peoples pure of speech, that they will call upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose. And how will all of this come about? And he states the entire world has already become filled with the mention of Messiah, Torah, and mitzvot. These matters have been spread to the furthermost islands to many stubborn-hearted nations, and they discuss these matters and the mitzvot of our Torah. And they say these mitzvot are true, but were already superseded in the present age and not applicable to all time. That's the Christian teaching. And others say that the mitzvot are not applicable, but Rambam concludes when the true Messiah will arise and prove successful, his position becoming exalted and uplifted, they will all return and realize that their ancestors endowed them with a false heritage, and their prophets and ancestors caused them to err. So we see that there is a method and a madness here. That, I'll share with you an interesting teaching. There arose in the 1800s a secular Jew of prominence in English politics. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. One time in an argument in Parliament, an anti-Semites ridiculed him for being Jewish, and Minister Disraeli stated, while the ancestors of the good gentleman, he was speaking, of course, politely, while the ancestors of the good gentleman were cave dwellers and primitive pagans, my ancestors were priests serving in the Temple of Solomon. Wow, what an insult. What a put-down. But if you look back into the history of the nations, while Solomon's temple was built almost 3,000 years ago, give or take a couple hundred years, and the culture of morality on the foundations of everything that today we hold sacred came from our Torah. And look at the nations around and how they were living. Indeed, they were pagan primitives. Human worship, human sacrifice, terrible, terrible things. The concept of how Western civilization is built is predicated upon these falsehoods. And as Erich Fromm has stated, that idolatry is not this or that observance. It's this or this concept of the mind. It's the imagery that we project and the underlying foundations, which is the psychology underneath it. Any building built upon a weak foundation is ultimately destined to fall. Let me share with you some very interesting words now of Rabbi Abraham Yitzhak Kook, one of the great, profound, mystical minds of the 20th century. I'm quoting from his Sefer Oroth, section Melfel, section 8. And this is his insight, prediction, if you will, about the future of Western civilization. He says, quote, "The sins of the murderers, the wicked kings, and all provocateurs is indelible. The blood that was shed in the land will be atoned only by the blood of those who shed it, and the atonement must come. Total dismantling of all foundations of contemporary civilization, with all their falsity and deception, with all their poison and venom. The entire civilization that rings false must be removed from the world, and in its place will arise a kingdom of the holy saints," making a reference to Daniel chapter 7, the 18th pasuk. Rav Kook continues and states, "The present civilization will disappear with all its foundations, literature and theater, and so forth. All the laws founded on inequality and iniquity, all evil etiquette will pass away. Therefore, the entire contemporary civilization is doomed, and in its ruin will be established a world order of truth and God consciousness." That is true peace on earth and goodwill towards man. But it has to be predicated upon the foundation of truth. And truth is a concept which many people today find very, very hard to accept. Understand now a very interesting teaching with regards to astrology. I mentioned to you earlier about the relationship of the planet Saturn, and how in Saturn, well, I'm going to quote to you from Erich Fromm again, from his Forgotten Language book on the Shabbat ritual, and you'll understand the relationship of how the non-Jew looked at the planet Saturn and how we Jews looked at it. Quoting here, Dr. Fromm writes, with regards to the Sabbath observance, because Sabbath remembers the day of Saturn. And he states that the Sabbath seemed to have been an old Babylonian holiday, celebrated every seventh day, and they called it Shabbatu. Remember, Babylon was taken over by the Persians, Mithraic religion. So this Babylonian Shabbatu was a day of mourning and self-castigation, somber day dedicated to the planet Saturn, whose wrath one wanted to placate by self-castigation and self-punishment. But the holiday changed in the Torah, where it lost its negative character and was no longer looked at as an evil day, but a good day, destined for man's welfare. Sabbath became the day of joy and pleasure, eating, drinking, singing, and additional study of Torah and mitzvot. The day of submission to the evil powers of Saturn, Shabbat became a day of freedom and joy. This changed in mood and meaning can be understood only if one considers the meaning of Saturn. Saturn symbolized time, the god of time, the god of death. But inasmuch as man is like God, gifted with a soul, with reason, love, and freedom, he's not subject to time or death. Inasmuch as man is not like an animal. The Babylonians sought to appease the Lord of time by self-castigation. The Torah concept of Shabbat is totally different. By stopping the interference with nature for one day, you eliminate time. Therefore, you eliminate the influence of Shabbat. So indeed on Shabbat, we don't bow to the Lord of time. The Torah teaches our victory over it. And such Saturn was denounced. And now you understand the concept of our sages when they say, Ein mazal leYisrael. There is no astrological influence to the Jewish people. Why? Because the Maccabees made it so. By their surrender to the will of God and willing to act upon it. Act upon truth rather than accept a lie. They broke the chains of the image in the mind of limitation. They broke the image in the mind of the lies, which have become the foundation of Western civilization and are embodied in this Christmas holiday, this time of lies. And surprisingly, the Christian world knows all about it. And they accept it with a shrug. I cannot understand why someone would be so willing to accept and embrace a lie. Other than for one reason. It's too hard to accept the truth. Now understand something about truth. Truth is hard to accept. Spiritual or psychological growth, and spiritual, psychological growth are one and the same, doesn't come easy. All this knowledge about the falsehood of Christmas is well known. I quoted to you mostly from Christian sources tonight. They know it, but yet they still do it. They embrace idolatry with ignorance and a shrug of the shoulder, not concerning themselves with the foundation of lies. And here we can share these words with our Christian friends, and they'll still shrug their shoulders. Some might get angry. Why would they get angry? They'll accuse us of Christian bashing. Why? All we're doing is describing a truth which many of their own people already know. Understand now the psychological barrier which we must overcome. And for that, let me share with you the words of Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology. Carl Jung writes, as a rule, graduation to the next level, next psychological level that is barred by violent prejudice and superstitious fears. In another place he states, a critical survey of oneself and one's fate enables a man to recognize his peculiarities. But these insights do not come to him easily. They are gained only through the severest of shocks. There is no birth of consciousness without pain. Now that is a profound statement. Here we are at the threshold of wanting to know truth, but apparently we are unable to know truth because we are so afraid to acknowledge the ramifications of what that must mean. But Rav Kook pointed to us what the future holds. Ultimately, inevitably, the foundations of a society built upon falsehood will collapse. And indeed, we see now Western civilization under assault from an outside enemy. Can Western civilization survive? Will it survive? The answer is no, it won't. No, it can't. Because a lie cannot stand on two legs. This goes back to the old Midrash where our sages say that the word sheker, if you look at the Hebrew letters sheker, shin, kuf, resh, the letter kuf is the only letter which goes down beneath the line where all the letters are even. And so our sages said sheker, lies, stand only upon one foot, the lower line of the letter kuf, which implies that it is always in a state of imbalance, always in danger of being exposed. But when there is exposure, violent prejudice and superstitious fears No birth of consciousness without pain. Severest of shocks. This is what awaits us as people come to know the truth. But the message of Hanukkah is to shine that light and to allow that shock to come, to overcome it, so that the purpose of Hashem in allowing the falsehood to come is so that the truth can rise up from it. And this is actually a very profound principle, which is discussed in depths in the Kabbalah. For those of you who are familiar with the Kabbalistic principles of what we call the shattering of the vessels and the fall of the light, we call the coming first of the world of the Nikudim and then following the world of the Birudim, which is the elevation of that which previously fell. That which fell first, so that it may be raised up. And indeed, this is what is happening now in the world body politic. So now when we come to this time of Hanukkah, a time of truth, a time for waving the banner of honesty, even at the point of self-sacrifice, in the face of lies, in the face of falsehoods, in the face of centuries of deception. That's what Christmas is. There's no peace on earth and goodwill towards man. It has nothing to do with anything in the Christian tradition. Even the good within the Christian tradition, there is good within it. And I want to conclude and I want to share with you this. Understand and know that there are millions and millions of God-fearing, God-loving, good-hearted Christian people in this world who I guarantee you are going to have a portion in the world to come. And you're going to be very surprised who and when they are, from all different walks of Christianity. God's not going to hold the lies that they have been taught against them, based upon the pasuk in the Sefer Malachi, where it says, from the rising of the sun to the going down thereof, great is my name amongst the nations. I have a tape on that. Go learn from there, the commentators of our sages say that God's not going to hold the mistakes of the intellect of the nations against them if their hearts are true before God. But for one to have their heart true before God, you must be able to share with them truth. And that truth will stir within them. It will challenge them. It will cause them great strife. Or as Carl Jung says, it will bring them the severest of shocks, and there's no birth of consciousness without pain. Therefore, what does Hanukkah mean? It means light. What does Christmas mean? Well, if we're going to call the lies the metaphor of darkness, then it means turning off the lights as Hanukkah turns them on. That was the original historical war in its day, the false against the true. It hasn't changed, has it? The war still goes on. The Maccabees of today are you and me. The war that we fight still continues. My blessing, my prayer for each and every one of us is that we continue the fight of truth. Whether you're a Jew, whether you're not a Jew, it doesn't make a difference. Truth knows no such boundaries. My blessings to you all, that the holiday of Hanukkah might truly bring light into your minds, into your hearts, into your souls, and that we might truly be able to shine that light into the darkness and bring tikkun. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.